Hello class, welcome to our continued discussion of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. This section will focus on part 6 of his essay. So, part 6 begins with Coates providing a critique of what he calls the old African-American ghetto. Think of things like the Harlem Renaissance as something in your head to kind of keep in mind. Essentially, Coates wants to demystify conceptions of an old ghetto being better or something positive. Old African American neighborhoods where things, were kind of quote unquote better. He wants to critique this idea of nostalgia because, as he says, this segregationist nostalgia ignores the actual conditions endured by the people living there and ignores the fact that the old ghetto was premised on denying black people privileges enjoyed by white Americans. So he wants to critique the idea that if we look back in the past and think of these old neighborhoods that were particularly African American were somehow better and quote unquote good, Coates wants us to remind us that this old view is still premised on all of the denial of privileges that he talks about in terms of home loaning, denying segregation, denying access to better neighborhoods, wealthier neighborhoods. He wants us to remind us that even if we look back in the past and see something that was quote unquote better, that it still has the same functional problems that he talks about throughout his essay. So, how does then Coates connect legal discrimination with extra-legal terrorism? If you remember from our discussion of part 5, he talks a lot about how the treatment of African Americans was terroristic, as in they were terrorized into submission. So Coates describes Chicago in particular in the 1940s and 50s as a place where African Americans could be simply attacked by moving into a neighborhood where they quote unquote didn't belong, trying to leave the segregationist housing policies of the time. And he gives a bunch of examples, including an attack on an apartment building that housed only a single family in the entire building was attacked by a mob that was throwing bricks and firebombs. He also notes that these rioters, like many people who engaged in these terroristic activities, were never punished. So when legal discrimination could not work, Coates wants to provide you with a bunch of examples where terroristic, extra-legal, non-legal practices were enacted. So if they could not be discriminated by the means of government and the law, Coates wants to note that African Americans were also terrorized and threatened and attacked. And then the law would kind of look the other way and there would be no justice. Coates continues and brings up this concept of white flight in his discussion of housing practices. So white flight is a term starting in the 1950s or in the 60s especially, and then continuing throughout the 70s and 80s, where we saw in the United States a migration of particularly white Americans from urban areas and city areas to suburbs and suburban neighborhoods. They left the city. So what Coates wants to do is that he wants to critique this idea that white flight was something that just happened. All right? He wants to say that white flight was like the segregationist housing policies that were found throughout the post-World War II era, that white flight occurred because it was easier to leave a neighborhood than live in a neighborhood where you might have a more diverse, less segregated population. So Coates is basically saying that white flight was a systematic extension of segregation and redlining. If the city was becoming too diverse, if it was becoming too hard to literally keep African Americans or other people of color out of your neighborhood, what happened is white people would then just leave, go to a suburb where it was much easier to create a segregated enclave, where it was much harder then for people of color to move into. So he wants to say that white flight, the leaving of the urban area, was not something that just happened. It was an extension of the various policies of redlining and segregationist housing exploitation that he has been describing to you throughout the essay. All right, he wants to say that this phenomenon, like many other phenomenons, had its basis in segregationist policies.